Next, and this goes hand in hand with being called, worship leaders must be servants. Now, what do I mean by that? From equipping your team with materials that you are able to equip them with, to giving lessons when you are able and if it fits your schedule and you can manage it, serve your people. When it's providing music for a context that's outside of your normal Sunday routine, be a servant. Serve your church with music in whatever capacity they call upon you to serve them with music. Now, I'm not suggesting that you go out of your way to essentially burden yourself with so much responsibility and so many obligations that you burn yourself out. I'm saying use discernment and bless your church with the gifts of music where it seems appropriate. Lastly, worship leaders must be balanced human beings. What do I mean? What I'm talking about is a worship pastor should be balanced with their levels of experience. It's kind of like a jack of all trades, but hopefully a little bit more than a master of none, if you get what I'm saying. The original phrase was a jack of all trade, a master of none, meaning you were really good at a lot of things, but you were never really a master of them. Now, there are many of you out there who are really good at communication. Some of you are really good at video editing or photography editing, or some of you are really, really good on guitar or just a specific instrument. That's what I'm talking about when I say that worship leaders must be balanced human beings. I mean that they should be pursuing being better at things in varying fields of interest. If you're a servant with a team of people, you need to be better at interpersonal communication. So you need to work on that and balance that with your musical side. If you're highly professional, you need to balance your ability to be professional with also being personal. It could also mean that you need to be better at setting boundaries for yourself. The Bible says in 1 Peter 5 that the devil crouches at our doorstep like a lion, seeking someone to devour. And all we have to do is give him an opportunity. That's why Peter also said, resist him and stand firm in your faith. God, he believes that you're capable for so much more and wants to see you become this balanced human being. The call that God has on our lives is for something deeper than just being a famous musician, to be bigger than just singing Christian songs for the world to hear. As worship leaders, we are called to serve people and serve our congregation humbly and without selfish motivations, which is part of why I said worship leaders must be called. Not every person in the world can do what worship leaders do week in and week out on a Sunday morning. Not to mention just the singing and musical playing stuff, but the biblical stuff, the coming around your team and praying for them and being intentional about not seeking your own interests, but instead seeking the interests of others and being more Christ-like than, frankly, a lot of the commercial music industry would have you believe you should do. So that's why being called is so important as a worship leader. Worship leaders actually must be called. Much like pastors, I think in today's culture, honestly, there's kind of a misnomer and a misleading reality about being called as a worship leader. If you're called as a worship pastor or worship leader, it actually does not put you at the same level as a senior pastor. At best, you're probably an elder or a deacon, if we're looking for some kind of biblical term to really give you an idea of like the call. But at the end of the day, probably more like a deacon than anything else. And it depends on your church's context, obviously, when we're talking about denominational structure, whether you observe deacons, whether you observe elders, you name it. At the end of the day, the reality is the senior pastor is there to shepherd the flock. You are there to shepherd the flock in a different way. But the calling is no less important.